You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Hello, this is Dana Cowan, and you are listening to the Progressive Hedonist Podcast. I'm so excited to introduce you today to Dan Barber, a chef who has been shaping the world of food for decades as the person behind Blue Hill Stone Barns, Roast 7 Seeds, and some of the most delicious meals that I've ever eaten. I was the editor-in-chief of Food and Wine magazine, and we had this program called Best New Chefs. Every year, we found 10 extraordinary chefs who are shaping the food world as we ate it. Dan was one of those chefs, and I still remember he had been a caterer and then opened a restaurant with a partner. He was just 2 years in. It was the very beginning, and that's when we love to get these chefs, just at the beginning of their careers, just when they showed the promise and they were working out their ideas on the plate. So when I was talking to Dan for this podcast, I was like, wow, Dan, you knew way back in the day that you were going to take on the world through the farm. And he's like, yeah, not so much. The reason that I ended up being so focused on ingredients and on the farm was because I was a really insecure chef. And I thought, what's the best way to have the best food? Well, if you start with incredible ingredients, you are starting way ahead of the game. So I believe that Dan was motivated in part by his insecurity, but he is also one of the most curious people I've ever met. And he has helped me and so many people through his book, The Third Plate. We thought when Farm to Table first was introduced, hey, this is going to be a game changer. Everyone's going to be thinking about Farm to Table, except for those people who are like, dude, if you're getting food, it's coming from a farm. What is this all about? Well, there are challenges with that farm-to-table model. If you want to support a farmer, going to the farmer's market, sure. But what you really need to do is open your mind to everything that makes a farm work. And that means cover crops. That means falling in love with buckwheat. And for me, it's partly falling in love with all of the ideas that Dan Barber has to help fix our food system. So let me know what you think. What are we going to do to fix the food system? Dan Barber has some ideas. Dan, I'm so happy to be here with you to talk about Blue Hill Stone Barns, to talk about Roast 7 Seeds, to talk about your book, which when I was at Food and Wine, The Third Plate, we had you write a little essay for us that I went back and read. You were so prescient. You were so ahead of the curve. I can't wait to hear what you think about how far we've come. But welcome to the Progressive Hedonist Podcast.
Thank you. I'm psyched to be here. I'm psyched you took me out of the kitchen for a few minutes. You know, the kitchen's right there, and I'm very, very happy to be right here.
We first met, as you may remember, in 2002 when you were a Food and Wine Best New Chef.
Yeah, you plucked me from obscurity in the West Village and made me who I am.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, I'll take that just for the purpose of this podcast. But you and Mike Anthony, I think, were cooking together, and you're a Best New Chef. You'd been in business for a couple of years. You had one restaurant. And when I was thinking about it, it reminded me of when I first got to Food and Wine. I had one magazine. That's it. That's all I did. And I worked around the clock 7 days a week. It was ridiculous. And by the end, I had a books division and a, website and all the things. And that's your journey from one restaurant to what you're doing today. I'm not saying it's similar to mine, but it's interesting you started with one restaurant and a singular idea. And I'm just curious how that idea, how you would describe it, and if it indeed, to, hack the metaphor, if indeed it was the seed for everything that has come to pass.
Well, what's interesting is everything has not been like Vegas restaurants. It's a different seed. This seed being I opened Blue Hill as an ode to my grandmother's farm where I grew up in the Berkshires. And this idea of like a neighborhood restaurant that was serving hyper seasonal food and an ode to small farming. soil-based small farming, which you didn't need to qualify 25 years ago when we opened. You didn't need to say soil, but now you need to say soil-based, as if that's becoming an outlier idea. Anyway, the galaxy of additions to 2002 have included another restaurant. I'm sitting at Blue Hill at Stone Barns, which is 30 miles from the West Village restaurant. But it's also included, this farm that's 300 acres surrounding us, and a cafeteria that serves hundreds of people every day for lunch and informal dinners, and a catering business that is across the courtyard, an off-site event business, and a consulting business, and now a seed company. So not multiple restaurants, but yes, multiple ideas. And you're right, it did start with this one idea. It was very straightforward, which was, how can we do a small neighborhood restaurant that really advertises the glories of local eating in the Hudson Valley?
And that is that centerpiece of honoring the soil and honoring the farmers has grown. And when I met you and you were a chef, I didn't envision that you were actually a philosopher chef or a breeder chef. You've become a hybrid chef in so many ways. And I'd love to hear you talk about the future of food as you see it, as all those hybrids, right?
Thank you for the compliment. I love a philosopher chef or whatever else you said. That's great. The truth is, I'm a very insecure chef, and I think that's what drove a lot of these revelations around ecology, environment, stewardship. I mean, I believe in them in the way that you believe in them, and the people who are listening to us believe in them. But the germ of this thing was like insecurity as me as chef, because my food, for whatever reason, I don't want to psychoanalyze this. I don't know why I became the kind of chef that is very simple in plating style. I'm not simple in technique, and I'm not simple in follow through. And there's high levels of technique and discipline. There's 40 cooks behind me that are practicing that. But at the end of the day, the plate, and this is from the beginning, there's never more than 3 ingredients, and it's extremely straightforward looking. Is the truth. I don't know why, like, the tweezers don't exist in my kitchen. I don't know. They never did. And I'm not saying that because I taste complicated food or tweezer heavy food and say, oh, that's such a waste of time. It's so pretentious. I don't. I actually think it's very delicious. There's so much good food happening today in America, as you know, and you helped create and helped broadcast so effectively. But my style's just incredibly simple looking. And so because of that, and I say insecurity really because I was focused on being successful, and I knew that I had to deliver on an experience. And we were entering into the photo age, of food. And I needed to make sure that not only did my plates look as beautiful as they could look, but they really delivered on the flavor. And then that got me to concentrate even more on farmers, which not just local farmers, but which local farmers and which ingredients. And then from there, like peeling an onion, you get to, well, it's not just which farmer at which time of year, but like, okay, well, what variety of something? And then you get to seed pretty quickly. And that's what got me through all of this. And as I'm looking at the whole of the onion, you start to see that these decisions that you're making have profound effects on how the world is used. And flavor in the hedonism world of describing this just is very much attached to good decisions. Good ecological decisions are flavorful and they're healthy. And that's a very nice, unexpected knock-on effect of my insecurity. So there you go. There's my awkward explanation for why I entered into the philosophy part of this thing. It was really driven by a desire to be a successful chef.
And how do you feel about success right now? Like, what defines your sense of success? Have you hit it?
Hit it. Oh my God. Do you? No. I was just this morning. I was just in a meeting with all the cooks saying how much work we have left to do here for today. I don't feel a sense of satisfaction. I'm trying to feel a little bit more happiness, towards this stuff because, my daughters who are 9, 8, and 11 call me Mr. Doom Doom, and I don't know, I want to change that. I'm going to try and be a little more positive in 2025. There's a goal.
The farm to table movement, I've heard you say, it's kind of a failed experiment. And I agree with you. It's something that I think about a lot because here I am coming into this space, which for me is climate and food and joy. And I look at all the people who've done the amazing work in the past, and I'm like, what happened? Like, why didn't it work? Why am I today coming to this quite late and saying, come on, like, why did it fail? Tell me, like, what was your interaction with it at the outset, and what do you think about that now?
Well, I set out to write a book about farm to table at the apotheosis of this movement in 2008. Obama was in the White House. You had the White House guard. There were so many elements, both in journalism, in chef's practices, in the drive towards mainstream understanding of the connection between a farmer and how you eat. And it just seemed to be the way the world was moving. So I was like, okay, I'm going to write essentially a cookbook, but it's going to be a narrative book. And I started out with a guy named Klaus Martens, who was a farmer, delivered this amazing wheat to me, this emmer wheat, this old biblical wheat. And I was making bread from it. I was milling it to order and making this bread that, people would sell their firstborn to have another slide of. Yeah, it's great. And so I went to find, okay, so what's the recipe for making wheat this delicious? And I'm at his farm, which is 2,500 acres in Penn Yan, New York. And I'm looking around and I didn't see a lot of wheat being grown. I saw a lot of cover crops. I saw a lot of leguminous crops, beans, and I saw barley and buckwheat and rye. And then, yes, I saw this organic, beautiful emmer wheat here as a slice of the pie, but a small slice of pie. And that was the moment. It was 2008 or 9. And first of all, the book went in a very different direction, but it was the moment of revelation, which was the emperor has no clothes. Here I am proselytizing, evangelizing over the need to buy local, support farm to table. And exactly what percentage of my hero farm, where I started my book and really hung my hat on being a local chef, because back then grains were really not a part of the conversation with locality. And yet I was supporting, 10% of the pizza pie. And what I learned on that moment, this is 10 minutes into the interview, was that the other 90%, the buckwheat, the barley, most of that, almost all of it, went into animal feed because there was no market for rye and barley and buckwheat. And so Klaus, this amazing, brilliant soil farmer, was doing techniques and rotations that were meticulously timed to lock and load the soil to be able to produce the kind of flavors, the flavonoids that I was tasting in this emmer wheat. It required this incredible rotation, right? And yet I didn't support any of it. So he was selling me the emmer wheat at a very expensive price, but he was supporting the entirety of the pie that allowed the soil to be locked and loaded to give me the emmer that was making me into this famous farm to table chef. And I remember I went back to the restaurant. I just started over. This doesn't work. Actually, it was that time that I started this thing of if you want eat your bread, you have to eat your rotations. And I started this thing called rotation risotto. That night, I remember I got back and I did a risotto out of all these unheralded, uncoveted grains that he was growing in his rotation, that he was making pennies on the dollar, pennies, because animal feed is very cheap, obviously. And, he was making his money on organic corn and organic wheat. And it was just and when you say, why didn't it work? Why didn't farm to table work? In part, I think actually it's right there. Organic is so expensive because we don't think about supporting the nose to tail of the farm. We talk about nose to tail of an animal. We never talk about nose to tail of an organic farm. What does an organic farmer need to grow to support a healthy ecosystem, a healthy soil ecosystem, a healthy environment? That's a huge diversity that is meticulously timed, as I said. And you need to support the whole thing to be a true farm to table chef. That's what I ended up writing the book about. And I do think that's been a failure. We have dumbed down the definition of what farm to table means. We've reduced it to a grocery list that you go to the farmer's market and you check off this, this, and this, and you're, a local eater. When in fact, we need to think about this much more deeply and strategically. And that's what I wrote the book about. And that's what I've devoted my life to.
And that's why you sell cover crops, right? I mean, you prepare cover crops, you are trying to do that nose to tail farm and teach people.
Right. Cover crops are planted to keep soil in place over a certain period of time. For example, Klaus would harvest the wheat and put in a rye cover or a leguminous cover where the harvest would happen in July. That would blanket the soil for the fall and winter, and he'd be ready to plant something in the spring. But that time between the harvest, July harvest of the emmer wheat, and the next spring planting is a long time. It's sunk real estate that Klaus is providing fertility for the next crop. Sometimes he could put in a crop, sometimes it's like a crop like buckwheat, which is actually not a grain. It's a broadleaf and it has all these benefits to soil rotation. So he may put in and may eke out a harvest of buckwheat in October, but the pennies on the dollar buckwheat, nobody eats buckwheat. So that goes into animal feed. So he's really making money once a year on small acreage for what is the Hummer of the food world, which is wheat. Wheat, corn, rice, Hummers of the food world. People don't realize that it takes so much fertility to eat those. So it's really king crops. And what we need to do is concentrate on the mix of crops that allow you to experience the pleasure of a king crop.
What's the answer to that? When I look at the cover crops, and I was walking at a friend's farm and pulling up radishes, right? They're beautiful. Or clover, which is beautiful. Or, these are beautiful ingredients. What is that next step to get
creating a market? It's an interesting concept because we think of cover crops as just, that's an organic dictate that's necessary, but it's now the farmer's responsibility to assume those sunk costs. And why aren't we participating in that is kind of the idea. So could we get to a point where we're actually, if you're asking me, well, what's the end game of this? It would be a cover crop salad at Sweet Green. Well, not the end game, but maybe that's the mid game. And then ultimately it's like clamshells of cover crops in every supermarket that you're buying, throughout the winter. And that would be an economy for the farmer, and it would be an economy for the biological community. What's interesting about this, which is sort of a late inning revelation, is that back when I was first thinking of like, okay, there's the pizza pie, I got to support this whole thing. Cover crops is a big one. I'm going to eat cover crops. There was a lot of farmers who were telling me, oh, no. Those cover crops are for the soil microbial community. You cannot take that because you're taking away from the feeding of ultimate fertility that you want and health for the next plant. Well, that turned out to be very not true. But that's because here at Stone Barns, we're a nonprofit. We did the testing, and it turns out that the biomass of cover crops is so great that taking up to 20% of a field does no effect on biological maturity and fertility below. In fact, it's the opposite. And this is what I find so interesting. It always corresponds, like great flavor and great stewardship. They almost always align. And I love this because what we discovered is that as we clip these cover crop greens for our salad, we're not actually we are stimulating root growth. And that, to me, it's just so fascinating that the clover or the vetch or whatever you're taking is freaking out that you have clipped. And now its root system is shooting new roots to get minerals to sprout again, because all it wants is to grow, right? To survive. And so actually what you are doing is promoting and achieving more biological community by taking some. It's just so interesting that is the net effect. So there's an example of how you can have your cake and eat it too. But it does come back to soil. It's like, what is the biggest carbon sink besides the ocean is soil. We talk a lot about trees, but soil is 4 times trees in the world. And we ignore soil, and soil is the one that is letting go of all this carbon. And so, as I like to say, our food system is releasing more carbon than trains, planes, and automobiles combined. And if we don't do something about this with agriculture, so it's a sort of a small thing. It's funny. The huge problem, and we're talking here about a little cover crop, but this is how we have to think about this. So,
I'd love to talk about the chefs in the kitchen and how you develop the dishes every day in conjunction with them and the farm, because I know, as you've said, you have a playlist, right? You do not have a menu, and the menu is part of what has damned the food system in the restaurant. So how do you work with the chefs and the team and the farm for a meal?
Well, this morning, the cover crop, over the break, we were closed for several days, and the Canadian geese ate all the rye cover crop. It was the most beautiful rye cover crop we've ever had. It was planted a little bit earlier, and it sprouted beautifully, and it was just like green sugar, and the geese all went for it. And so the salad that we were doing different variations of it doesn't taste right without the rye. I needed the rye just at this moment. At this, that we're about to get some clover and some pea shoots. Actually, that'd be great. But tonight I don't have it, so I'm busy trying to make a ravioli dough out of the cover crop, and that's what I'm dealing with. That. So that's the kind of thing that it starts in the morning with like, okay, well, how are we going to negotiate what we have and turn it into a message? Because it's I feel like a lot of this is so much is communication and messaging, and so. And when I sat down here, I was trying to think, how are we going to communicate cover crops through a pasta dough? I have no idea. And that's what I got to figure out before 5 o'clock tonight.
I'm sure you will do it. I was in the kitchen recently and fed deliciously, and I was tasting some of the things you were trialing. There were bananas. I was eating a banana in winter. Yes. Can you tell me a little bit about the things that you're trying and testing?
We are testing varieties of vegetables and fruits that at this time of year can withstand the cold. But really, throughout the course of the year, we are trialing new varieties that can withstand disease pressure, increased heat, new pathogen pressures. And the goal is to get those varieties, whether it's a beet or a carrot or a broccoli or a variety of an animal, genetics in an animal, we are trying to look at it through the prism of deliciousness. At the same time, there's a Venn diagram that deliciousness has to produce well in the field. And if we hit on the varieties where you have a lot of deliciousness and you have good economic potential return for the farmer, that's the kind of thing we advertise through our menu and through our nonprofit Stone Barns to spread the word. Back to your point, we can do a lot through this nightmare of climate change by changing our diets. And we're only going to do it if it's delicious. And that's our job, is to use our palates to spread a message that is really affirming.
Let's talk about row 7 a little bit, because in fact, you have introduced so many unusual, delicious, surprising things onto the market. And with a bit of a sense of humor, right? Like a habanada pepper, for example. As I had said at the beginning of the podcast, we've known each other a long time. I remember that bread. I remember the Barber wheat. I have been lucky enough to eat at Blue Hill Stone Barns many, many times.
Not enough.
Not enough.
Says
okay.
my grandmother. Not enough.
But I remember sitting with you in New York City, actually, and we were talking about your next project, which was around seeds. And I found in my email to prepare for this conversation my thoughts after that. And I just have to tell you, because it's embarrassing, and it was in my drafts, and I really hope I didn't send it to you. And it says, Dan, I'm really excited about your seed project. I think it needs a name. I'm happy to brainstorm anytime.
It's hilarious. I didn't tell you the name, or I didn't have it then?
You didn't have it. And you're like, Dana, do you have any thoughts for names? Like you work with words every day. And I'm like, I absolutely want to help you.
What happened? You should have sent that. It could have been called what?
Oh my God. Do I want to tell you? So domain dirt.
Nice.
Yeah.
Love that.
That was one of the better ones. The sustained seeds.
Wait, did you send me this?
I don't know.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I thought you were just riffing on names now. You're saying this was in the draft email.
This is
my
it.
God. What domain dirt? That's hilarious.
Domain dirt, seed the future, grow taste, the tasty breed, the tasty seed, the seeding project.
Seeding project. Nice. I love those. That's so smart.
But then you came to row 7. I'm like, wait a minute, that wasn't on my list.
I'll tell you why we named it row 7.
Exactly. Tell me why you named row 7. I think I actually know why. Tell me why.
The genesis of row 7 was this breeder actually came in to eat, and I invited him back to the kitchen because at that time, as I said, I was getting more and more interested in seed and identifying seed varieties. And up until that moment, this is now 2008 and 9 again, it was like all about old seeds, which is why we're evangelists for heirlooms and heritage breeds and all that, because you pass them down through generations because they taste good. And so chefs are always evangelists for heirlooms. But this guy came, he's a modern squash cucurbits breeder, deals with squash. And it's a chance, one of my cooks was cleaning a butternut squash. And in the awkwardness, I'm awkward with people I don't know. I'm also awkward with people I do know. But in this case, I just didn't know what to say. I was just sort of joking around. I was like, if you're such a great squash breeder, which I'd heard he was an up and coming genius squash breeder, why don't you breed a butternut squash that actually tastes good? Why are we told in every recipe to add brown sugar and maple syrup and butter to make the thing serviceable for Thanksgiving? Because, it's just like that. And he got very serious and came up real close to me and said, the reason I've never bred a butternut squash that tastes good is because no one's ever asked me to breed for flavor. And that was the beginning. That was sort of a before and after moment for me.
It still gives me goosebumps to hear you say that. Just the idea that no one's
talking to this guy about what the hell the thing tastes like. And so they have other concerns, size, color, shape, storability, yield, all the things. And what I've learned since is that when you are dealing with those things that I just listed and many other criteria around aesthetics, you're breeding against flavor. It's not just that you're prioritizing those things, you're actually breeding against it.
Why is that, Dan? Why is it that longevity, shippability, conformity, why does that go against flavor?
Well, I'll give you one example. Butternut squash is bred at a certain size, right, which is quite large. 83% of butternut squash is water. Why is it water? It's water because farmers, distributors, processors, the market, they all weigh your vegetable and charge you accordingly. So weight is the thing. And since water was free 50 years ago when they started this whole messiness of breeding like this, water was king. And so one explanation for why vegetables haven't tasted very good over the last 50 years, and you can name, it's not just squash, but you can name across the board, is because we've taken on tons of water in the breeding, in the selection process, that has diluted flavor and nutrition. You read a lot about these studies that say that broccoli and carrots are all demonstratively less nutritious than 50 years ago. It's not that we bred against nutrition, it's that we bred for water and you're washing out nutrition. That kind of information was what I started to learn when I was talking to this guy, his name's Michael Mazurek, and other breeders that just came out of the woodwork because he introduced me to people and I started talking about this. And all of a sudden I was in a portal to another world, and it wasn't farmers, it was breeders. And I thought, Jesus, these are the guys, most of their guys who are writing the recipes for the future of food. It's not the farmer. Actually, in many ways, when the farmer gets the vegetable, the cake's been baked. Like the best farmer in the world, if that farmer doesn't have the genetics to turn on, if they aren't there, they won't be expressed in the best soil conditions. So it very much doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, it's too strong a word. You need the farmer and you need the soil and you need all the and I think you need an organic community, organic practices to express genetics. I am not an evangelist for organic because I'm an environmentalist, but I am an environmentalist. I'm an evangelist for organics because truly it is the only way to unlock breathtakingly, jaw-droppingly delicious flavors. It is. It absolutely is. And so I've stopped being an evangelist for old heirlooms because this goes back to what we were just talking about is like, how do you make a movement successful? It's not by privileging the 1%, which is what heirlooms are. The heirlooms are very unproductive. Heirlooms mean they've been passed down, they've been protected and passed down and unchanged for generations because they taste so good. There is important genetics within those, but as the world has continually changed, they've not been updated and they're very unproductive. And if it's too rainy or it's too dry or there's a new disease, which there always is, or a new fungus, which there always is, they are completely exquisitely vulnerable and they die. And that's why heirlooms are so expensive. So what this breeder and many others now have taught me is that take the old genetics, but update them, modernize them, make them better. And that's what row 7 is. We take old genetics and we privilege and prioritize flavor. What I did not understand when I set out to do the company is that in privileging and prioritizing flavor, you're privileging and prioritizing nutrition. Nutrition and flavor are the same thing. Flavonoids are flavor, and they run along the same genetic lines. So while I'm wearing this white coat for you, I could be wearing a very different white coat and make my grandmother even more proud of me. Yeah.
We're going to be calling you Dr. Barber soon. And why is it that flavor and nutrition go together?
The easiest way I've come to learn this is that a plant that's in an environment that needs to survive by itself is taking on characteristics that we might call polyphenols or we might call terpenoids. They're all these chemical reactions that a plant puts into practice when they are vulnerable. Those attributes end up tasting really delicious. Not just sweet, it's not sweetness necessarily, but depth of flavor, even a kind of acidity, a kind of bitterness, just complexity is all in that defense of the plant. What we have done in 50 years, as you know, is create an agriculture system where intervention rules so that you are putting a plant out that's essentially very weak. And that's okay because you can spray the problem away. Where what I've learned, and I'm just new to this. I mean, we're 5 years into this company. It is such a racket. Right now, the world of seeds is owned by 4 companies. It's 65% of our seed supply, almost 70% of our seed supply is in the hands of 4 companies.
And they're chemical companies, right? And they also lock up the seed.
They lock up the seeds, they patent genetics, and they're chemical companies. They don't make the money on the seed. They make the money on the intervention. So they sell you the seed like a Trojan horse to get on your farm. And then in order for the seed to work, and by work means it gets the yield it needs, you have a seed package with a chemical package attached to it. That's the whole thing. It's such a rigged game. And that's 65% of our food supply worldwide. It's not the idea that 4 chemical companies control 65% of our food supply does not make one hungry. Because where is the incentive for these companies to produce a plant, going back to a strong plant produces deliciousness and nutrient density? Where is the incentive for that? There is none. Zero. It is in the chemical cocktail where you make them. You actually lose the money on the seeds. I know I'm in the seed business, and I can tell you lose money on the seed. There's no money in seed. There's money in intervention. And it's very interesting. In that sense, it's very dystopian.
It's entirely dystopian because they block the ability for someone to create a hybrid or to create their own seeds or to save seeds or to really replenish their own land. And instead, they're extracting from the land. And the thing that I very naively don't understand, I'm curious your perspective, is they're killing the soil, right? So for them to be in business in the long term, what's their next trick? Because once the soil has blown off the farm because it's all dead because of the herbicides and pesticides, then what? Then the farms are dead and we have no food and there's no water.
Well, now you know why venture capital is going so strong into other types of farming and replacement for farming, indoor farming and fake meat, all the things that take soil out of the equation because everyone sees the writing on the wall. So the investments, billions, is towards that. It's not just that soil's disappearing, it's that soil's becoming harder and harder to grow in because the climate's changing and the variability is very difficult.
This episode is brought to you by Plugra European-style butter, crafted for those who demand precision and exceptional results in the kitchen. With 82% butter fat and a slow churn process, Plugra gives you flakier crusts, fluffier cakes, and rich, melt-in-your-mouth pastries. Because great baking starts with great butter. Unlike standard American butters, which have only 80% butter fat, Plugra ensures the ideal moisture and fat balance so your recipes turn out just right every time. That's why professional chefs trust Plugra and home bakers love it. Plugra's slow churn process creates a smooth, creamy butter that gives dough a soft, pliable texture, making rolling, folding, and laminating effortless. Whether you're perfecting a buttery pie crust or layering a delicate croissant, Plugra helps you bake with confidence. Experience the difference for yourself. Find Plugra in stores near you or visit plugra.com. That's Plugra.com.
I've been interested when you said the flavor in the vegetables that you're growing, the row 7 vegetables or the things you're trialing, there's so much flavor that you don't need all the other things piled on. And as a home cook, barely, but as a restaurant goer and eater, I can imagine the economics of that.
Salad is a good example of what we're talking about. We have a culture in this country where salad is a vector for fat. It's this vector for ranch dressing and for bacon bits. And, what if we thought of salad as something that carries its own fat in terms of the depth of flavor? Salad's the number one eaten vegetable in the United States, you know, and we breed for no nutrition. You know, we breed for iceberg and romaines, and then there's some fiber, but there's not nutrition. So what if we turn that on and said, that's what we're working with a breeder who's a former Monsanto breeder who left because he doesn't want his gravestone to read, you know, I was a Monsanto breeder. I bred the number one eaten vegetable in the United States, and we have a nutrition crisis. You know, 60% of this country right now has at least one chronic disease that is directly linked to our diet. 60%, you know, 40% have more than one. So, and lettuce, I just turned to lettuce because it's number one eaten. Like, how could you turn that tide through this delicious varieties? I mean, this guy is doing stuff that, like, I became enamored with him because I went to this Willy Wonka breeding field of his. I saw all these lettuces that I didn't even know could be like deep purple, huge anthocyanin romaines that were just like as big as trees. I mean, it's just like incredible stuff and then I passed this row of what looked like spinach. I was like, oh man, you're doing salad and spinach too? And he's like, oh, no, I know people in America have this obsession with spinach salad. And it always pisses me off. So I did a romaine that looks like spinach, and it has the nutrient density equivalent of spinach. And you just think about how many people eat a romaine salad.
So is it crunchy? Like, I've seen it. It's fluffy. You know, it looks like a head of spinach, but it crunches like a romaine?
It crunches like a romaine, yeah. And it has the flavor that just like you stop eating, you're like, whoa, I'm going to taste this for the next 5 minutes. It's like incredible. Why aren't greens like that widely available? They taste great. They're incredibly nutrient. You know, it just, and the answer is like, we have a culture that is skewed towards romaine and iceberg, and we need to upset that. You know, we need to turn it on its head.
I mean, again, I feel like this is another one of the sort of communication marketing challenges, because same with protein in the center of the plate, right? Like, why do we only eat, you know, one kind of whatever, 3 kinds of meat? There's chicken, there's beef, there's pork.
And why make such a central focus on our plate? What, like no other culture or cuisine has ever. Our westernized conception of a plate of food is really a conception of a celebration dinner at any other culture. Because if you look around, everyone has a smattering of meat with grains as principal and vegetables as central. And meat is really a condiment. I mean, in all the great cuisines of the world, that's the truth. It's not like, you know, you go to India and you have a couple of meals and you're like, oh man, I really miss delicious food. It's like, what? No, go to Cantonese. I mean, everywhere you look, that's that way because it was built off of what the landscape could produce. You know, landscape couldn't produce the kind of protein that we have been able to produce through chemical agriculture. That's the truth. You know, and we have 190 million acres of corn and soybeans that goes to feed an animal. It's like, it's the craziest. It's the most wasteful system of agriculture ever invented in the history of the world. And we're sitting here exporting it all over. And if we look at, and that's why cuisine is so interesting to me, because cuisine is putting the pieces together of a landscape, of a very local landscape. And that goes back to that standing on the hilltop looking at this guy Klaus's farm. That was a cuisine, and putting the pieces together is really what we need to do. That's what farm to table needs to be. And it needs to be more hyper local and needs to be more attuned to what the landscape needs to grow.
I think that the idea about the hyper local with the food also relates to a hyper local with everything, right? Like for energy, there's hyper local energy potential, solar. There's hyper local money potential. There's hyper local potential of helping your neighbors and knowing your community and attacking the isolation crisis. It's just so interesting to me that the things that are appropriate and necessary for food are actually appropriate and necessary for a community to survive.
What a great point. I hadn't thought of it that way.
And I think that, you know, what you're doing with row 7, I love that you're hitting some kind of scale. It sounds like because you're growing on the West Coast, growing on the East Coast, like what is your dream for the scale you could achieve with these really delicious vegetables and greens?
Yeah, I like to think of not scale, but how are we spreading this? Yeah, it's true that we're concentrating in one company. So I guess that there's a way to look at it. I'm like more interested in what are the genetics that are appropriate for place. You know, you were the champion, and your magazine was the champion of restaurants and chefs expressing themselves individually. that people actually travel to different parts of the country, to different restaurants specifically, not to get the same thing. No. You go to the restaurant to get the thing you can't get anywhere else and you Instagram it. I don't want to be all dystopian. That's a very positive outcome of this and potentially a pointing a way for the future that's uplifting. Look, we are a country that, doesn't have any cuisine. That's part of our problem. But here we are looking more and more at locality and distinction as a way to hang your hat. And we are a country that moves with dizzying speed on trends. I mean, we do sushi, kale, Greek yogurt, like you name the thing. Like where did those things come from? Nowhere. And now they're mainstream. And you can't say that about Japan or France or Italy, I have this and I don't mean to be, falsely positive, but I do have the sense that people are waking up to this idea that local food is glorious and important to and exciting to dive into. I have this idea that we can, with that dizzying speed, change the way we're eating quite quickly, certainly compared to other countries. And the one thing about Americans that also is great is we're hedonists, We are somehow willing to spend more money for pleasure. And if we could equate that pleasure with deliciousness and nutrition and the fact that it would equate to healthy ecologies, I think that's pretty positive and possible.
I mean, I agree with you completely. It's the entire foundation of progressive hedonist.
I just said, oh, did I? Oh, God. Okay.
No, it's I love having somebody else use the words. And I'm like, yes, it's that thing. Well, it is. If you look at kogi nut or any of the things that you put into the world that have had such vast adoption, and I think you were talking about there was a festival for your beet, but it wasn't about Row 7. It wasn't about Dan Barber, which is kind of great.
No, it's not about me. That's why it's called Row 7. And by the way, called Row 7 because there's two reasons. One is I said 65% of chemical companies own seed. The way they develop seed now is through genomics. You really do it through computers, and you're looking at because the genome has been mapped of everything, and so you're looking for traits that you're identifying, and then you can quickly pinpoint them, and that's how you move breeding along. And I felt, based on what I was learning, that we need to be back in the fields looking at the rows. What is actually being expressed in local environments. They're looking at one size fits all. You can grow a carrot in Michigan, Texas, Southern California, New York, and China and have it all yield the same. That's really dumbing down genetics. And, to look at that from the inverse is to look in the rows and see how things are expressing in their environment. That was one. And then the other one was when I was in failing ninth grade chemistry, I was always fascinated by this seventh row of the periodic table, which had empty spaces, but no name, no identity. And my one intelligent question I asked Margot Gumport, my chemistry teacher.
Oh my God, my brother had Margot Gumport. No.
You're kidding me.
No.
She was amazing. She really hated me. I mean, I really did terribly. But I remember that. I remember the day when I asked her that. It was everyone was leaving the classroom. And I just said, "What?" I was just so curious. And she said she was so happy I was asking a halfway intelligent question and showing interest in chemistry. And she said, it's because those are elements that scientists know exist but have yet to be named. I just was like, that's so cool. And here we are now. I'm not going to date myself, but more than 30 years after that, more than 40 years after that question. And that seventh row has been filled in. The elements have been named. And what I love about that is that's why I'm looking out on a field and there are genetics that are out there waiting to be expressed, pinpointed and named. And that's very promising. So I think for the future, very hopeful.
I have just a couple of questions that I always ask my guests. This is really a fun one for you, Dan. I've seen you on some interviews and you're like in a pugilistic mood and sometimes you're not. But my question is, what is your most controversial opinion?
That organic can feed the world. I mean, that's what I run up against. The first thing everyone says is, yeah, you sound so, excited, but there's starving people out there. And what are you talking about? We have 190 million acres in the Midwest. It's some of the most productive farmland in the world. And we're feeding it, we're not eating 1 ounce of that food that's produced. We're either funneling it through a cow or through our gas tanks in the most inefficient food system in the history of the world. So when people say, how are you going to feed the world? Well, look at what we're doing now. First of all, we already are feeding the world. The fact that people are starving and undernourished is more about politics than and distribution than it is about tonnage. We've done plenty of tonnage. We've tonnage enough to feed 2 worlds. It's not that. It's that it's so inequitable, and it's so inefficient. So the big food industry has been selling that point, that scare tactic, for 50 years, 60 years, and it's very effective. Because you have to sit here and spend the 3 minutes we just spent trying to debunk it.
Yeah. And I heard you say that, well, Michael Pollan has said to you, he underestimated big ag, right? Like, why did farm to table fail? There's many, many reasons, but one of them is big ag wanted farm to table to fail.
As he always does, synthesizes ideas long before any of us do. And that was one that he said to me 2 summers ago. We didn't realize how strong and how fierce the battle was. And I have been thinking about that ever since. And he's so right. He's so correct. And it's been hard to see because it's been a brilliant campaign and we are suffering the consequences of it. And in large part, he's not out of, he's out of food specifically, in part because, as he said, I did what I could do. But you're talking about forces that are quite, I remember when I had the chance to cook for Obama the night before he was inaugurated. It was him and Michelle. And then Sam Cass, who was the personal chef for the Obamas. And I'll never forget, I was talking about the red states and the ag policies, actually about the 190 million acres of corn and soybeans, essentially. And I'll never forget, he turned to me and he said, I'm not going to go near those guys. They scare me.
Wow.
And I remember thinking, like, dude, give him a higher approval rating than Jesus Christ. And at that moment, and you're saying, and he's from Illinois, he knew, I'm not doing that. And he looked at Michelle, he said, that's what you're going to do it apolitically through the White House garden. Whether you agree with him or not, the fact that he recognized the power of the interests at play in agriculture shows you why we have not been successful. I think that tide is turning. But then again, I thought that in spades in 2008. So here we are.
What is the word that you think of when you wake up in the morning that is your motivating word?
Deliciousness. I mean, it's so easy. Deliciousness, because everything else you say is just noise. Nobody listens to anything. But if it's hedonistic and delicious and memorable, it lands. And that's what I say to the cooks. It's like, just hit it. Nail it. And you have a chance to do it. It's very hard. Jerry Seinfeld always talks about Lindsey Vonn hitting the gates. How she goes, and she just, she's going to nail the gates. Doesn't matter where they place them. She's going to nail them. And that's what I say to the cooks. It's like, you're climbing the tower. It's a long day. Ring the bell. Get the flavor. And be absolutely driven and maniacal about it. And then we have a chance.
And the last question is, if you're going to put together the perfect, delicious, climate-friendly meal, what would that be?
Well, it would depend on when we're eating. But right now, I think the cover crops would be on the menu. I have to tell you that. And I think that there's a variety that I'm looking at right now. I'm looking at you, but I'm also looking Bloomsdale spinach, which is in the field, which was bred by a brilliant breeder in the Pacific Northwest who puts his spinach through what he calls half acres of hell. And the ones that survive, literally few plants, he selects and keeps going, and then gets the genetics that are super strong. And right now I'm looking at, what are we at? 10, 15 degrees today with the wind chill, and that spinach out there is thriving. And so I love this example of what an ideal meal would be now, because what if we had that kind of approach, selecting varieties that go through 5 acres of a half acres of hell? What could we do for deliciousness, nutrition, and environmental stewardship for the future? And that my meal would really be a bowl of spinach that's grown in 15-degree weather right now.
What's next, Dan? I know that you have some other ideas on the drawing board. You have some other ideas percolating.
Well, I'd like to spend more time with my daughters. They're 11 and 8, and everyone tells me, in fact, I think it was you who told me that, oh, this is the sweet time. That's what I woke up thinking about this morning. If I don't enjoy this time, if it isn't the best time, then I'm going to look back and say I screwed it up, because it's supposed to be the magic time. So I'm putting a lot of pressure on myself. So this year I'm going to spend more time. But what is next is like figuring out, how do you create a seed company that long term has value? And it's not through selling chemicals. We know that. So how do you create a food company out of a seed company, which is, what we're doing, what we're figuring out as we move along.
And what do you think about legacy? Or do you ever think about legacy?
I mean, if I admitted to thinking about legacy, it would sound really highfalutin. The true answer is I don't think about it, but I think the truth is I probably do. And what better way to leave a legacy than you could leave your name on Lincoln Center? Yeah, that's not going to happen with me. But what about the legacy of all these seed varieties that live on? That's a legacy. It won't be under my name. But maybe that is what's driving part of this, is like my need to have a legacy effect. And I'm doing it through genetics. I hadn't thought of that till right now.
It's actually a beautiful thing, right? Genetics and legacy are quite interrelated. Yours happen to be things that grow and give life. Yeah.
And that's inspiring, sure. But I hadn't thought of it as a legacy project.
Well, as a long-term project at the very least. Well, thanks, Dan. It's always a complete delight to talk to you. And I'm so excited to just eat what you continue to grow and experiment with. We didn't even talk about like your amazing breeder stories. I love the breeder stories. I love the fact that the garlic was handed over, sweet garlic was handed over to you. Like, I love that. I mean, I love all of the oddballs and the people that you rescue from obscurity and the seeds that were going to die in the drawers and the things that hadn't been thrown out that now have a chance of life and that we all get to eat better for you. So grateful to you and all that you're doing, legacy or not.
Thank you, Dana. What a pleasure.